In this video, we are going to be building our own enrichment API that allows us to send emails in and then get LinkedIn data back. So this is going to be really useful if you're running any inbound workflows. It's something that I've set up personally for my line of work. Let's get into it. So if you're not familiar with Clay, really quick, it's the best go-to-market tool for outbound lead enrichment or inbound enrichment. So if you have a list of emails or incoming emails that you want to, let's say, go and research the companies using AI agents by having the agents go and visit websites and researching the website to see if that fits certain criteria that you're looking for in ICP. Or let's say you have a list of emails or incoming emails and you want to go and find the corresponding LinkedIn address like we're about to do now. Clay is the best tool to go and do that. So we are going to be basing this off of another guide that I've written on setting up an API to send in a LinkedIn email. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to fork two things, and I'm going to include links to both of these in the description below. But the first thing that we're going to want to do is fork the code that will make up our API. I'm going to fork this REPL, and then I'm also going to fork this Clay table template. So this will also be included in the description. I click this blue button, and then once that's started, you want to double check. You want to click this plus button, and that will load in the Webhook resource. So you want to see this little symbol, not the little data stack symbol that I had before to the left. And you'll want to see also this URL. Quick note, do not make this public anywhere that you don't want it to be seen or abused by anyone, because it will allow anyone else to use up your Clay credits if they know this URL. I'm going to go ahead and delete this after this video, but just FYI. The other FYI to keep in mind is Webhooks might only be available if you are on the free trial. So I'm actually on a free trial right now, but if I wanted to use Webhooks within Clay, you will have to upgrade to this tier, the Explorer tier now. That's a recent change they made. I also have a link below that will allow you to sign up for Clay to get some extra credits. If you go ahead and use that, that is my affiliate link, but that should give you a little boost if you're looking to try it out for this tutorial, and it'll be completely free for 14 days. So let's dive in, and let me quickly just show what the Clay table does on its own. It's very simple. This webhook is going to receive data, and from that data, one of the fields that's going to be included is going to be the email address. So again, we're going to mimic an inbound form. Inbound forms always include, insert your email here at the very least. I've also seen people use this same method to just like have people submit their website name and their first name. And Clay has a bunch of data providers that just by using the first and last name of someone plus the company domain, it's able to locate people's LinkedIn URL or work email address. The reason for that is because you can see here, it's got all these different data providers. So for this one search where we're going to take one input, the email address, and look for LinkedIn profile, it's going to go across and waterfall through these four data providers, and you can line up more. But basically, Clay is partnered with all of these data providers to include them all right here in the platform. Each one of these varies in credits. So if I just click on here, it'll show how many credits it uses. So 2 if it hits this, but it saves you on having to go sign up for all of these individually. And what it's going to do is as soon as one of these succeeds in finding a valid LinkedIn profile, it's going to stop the rest. So it won't go on and move on to the rest if one of these is already solved. So it saves you money automatically. And then we're going to go ahead and import that data and send it right back. As soon as we find a matching LinkedIn profile, we send it right back. So long ramble, but basically we're taking an email and then getting all of the LinkedIn data related to that person's work email address. Let's go back here. So this is again the code where our API is going to live. The very first thing that we're going to do, if you've seen the video on API fundamentals, I suggest you check that out if you're watching this video. But we have this internal API key here, which is used for protecting and keeping this API just for us and our internal team. So we want to keep this secret. For the sake of this video, I'm just making it 123 ABC. And then again, the other thing we want to keep secret is our webhook URL. So if we click on that, if we click on sources, you definitely want to keep this private. I'm actually going to switch that to JSON. That's new. We can't set up mapping because no data is there. So the first thing that we're going to do is just send a test request directly to the Clay table. So let's do that. We're going to go grab that URL and then add that secret there. And there we go. And again, that's the same URL that we had here that we want to keep a secret. I'm also going to open up a shell And what I'm going to do is let me ask the AI or Replit assistant to make me a curl command. And I'm going to demonstrate why we're even setting up an API around the Clay table. Because people might be like, well, why don't we just, if we have a webhook, I'm familiar with webhooks. I know how they work. I know how to call them. Why don't we just call it directly? And I'm going to show you in a second. So let's make a curl command post request to this endpoint with body. We're going to say email ratio.com and the message, we'll say something really cool. And then I'll get into this in a second later on why we are including this, but I'm just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And that's all we need. And you can see, again, if you saw our last video on API fundamentals, we don't include a header or anything like that. We just include the body, and we could call this webhook directly. So I'm going to pop that in here. Hopefully it'll work and it's formatted nicely. And then boom, you see the response that we get right away is success equals true. And then it stops. But asynchronously, so on its own, this thread, you can see it's still running here with this little loader icon. It's running on its own, and it did actually go ahead and find my profile tied to my ID. So we shot in that request directly in to the webhook, and then it ran. Great. And then it completes and it ends right there. We can come back and let's say if we wanted to, let's say this happened 1,000 times. So all of your submissions are going directly into here. You would be able to go in and export that data as like an enriched list. So plain old emails go in, you get nice enriched data on LinkedIn profiles, et cetera, et cetera. And again, you can come in and add any other columns. So if I go to column and if I go to enrichment, just FYI, you can set up a whole bunch of other data sources to add any extra enrichments that you need within Clay. But okay, it ends here. Now going back to what's the purpose of setting up a whole API, or what's the purpose of this video, let's go over to this little graphic I have here. So let's say what is currently happening is, let's say you had an app or workflow like your inbound form. You could call that Clay table directly. Again, let's say you keep that URL completely secret. We could call it directly, just call it directly like we just did in that curl command, like we did in the shell. And we'll come back here. We could call it directly. It runs the enrichment flows just like it did. And then once it's done, it goes to another. So it does like all the LinkedIn enrichments. It can go and get shot over straight into another workflow. Let's say maybe a workflow tool like Zapier or make.com. And at that point, you'd see like at the very last column, Clay, all of these columns run in order unless you change up the logic, which you can. But I won't get into that tutorial right here. Maybe we'll do a dedicated one to Clay. You can use their HTTP API call. So let me go back to add enrichment. The one that I'm using is this HTTP API. But again, I forked that template at the very beginning of this video and I already have it set up. You can see the endpoint that it's calling is not a real URL. It's not a real endpoint. And then it's going to send the completed data. So if I hover over this is the data just pulled. So this is like my LinkedIn profile data. So I could shoot this over into another workflow like make.com or Zapier, but that's starting another thread or another process. So each of these is ending on its own. So that initial call to Clay, you can see back here, we just get a success equals true, and then it's done. It ends. And then it will start a separate calls, like a series of calls within Clay. And then that ends as soon as it gets the LinkedIn data. It ends as soon as it gets that. And then it shoots over, in one of these hypothetical calls, if we set it up the endpoint to be like a Zapier webhook or something else, it could go and start that thread as well. So like if you're just looking to chain together a bunch of workflows, that can work. But if you're trying to do something like make a tool for an AI agent, let's say you have an AI agent, this represents the entire run of an AI agent. Let's say it's like an AI researcher that give it a command like, hey, go research and find me people that fit my ICP. And let's say your ICP is like business development reps. That agent run has to run on the same thread. Like it can't really stop and then call something else. It needs to be able to wait for it to complete. In technical terms, so tech fundamental lesson here is we're basically just chaining together a bunch of synchronous calls. And instead of letting the thread of the enrichment, like the enrichment workflow, run asynchronously like it would in this process, we're making it run synchronously. So you can see here, this whole step, it wouldn't end here. It continues in the same thread. So basically it's going to wait until the clay table returns the data that you're looking for so that I can perform logic using that data within the same thread, and it won't like stop or kill its research process. So in summary, basically the AI agent, if it did this process, if it attempted to use, your clunky tool of calling the clay table directly, and then at the end of the workflow, it calls Zapier or some other workflow tool. Once it makes this leap, your AI researcher will never be able to get that data. It will never be able to get that data because as soon as it calls the workflow, the clay table webhook, directly, all it's going to get every single time is just success equals true, because clay is made to run asynchronously, not synchronously as like a single API. So hopefully that gives you some insight, and then it'll make a lot more sense in a second. So what we want to do is make a single API endpoint that we can call. So back to the example of our AI agent tools are basically just APIs. So it's just like, if you want your agent to be able to generate images, you would just give it access to an API that generates images and tell it how it can send arguments in. For our AI agent, for researching, if you wanted to get... All right, so now that we have the correct endpoint and we've set our internal API key, let's go ahead and run it. Again, we're going to run this clay table, but as an API call. And our API call is not going to return anything until it successfully has the LinkedIn data, which in our case, for this email that we're sending in, you can see we're hitting and getting the matching LinkedIn profile right away. So let's do it again. Run it. Let me clear this for hit clear, and then mimic the post request. There we go. Now we can see this running in the background on its own while this one waits. So it's the same processes. It's all waiting, but we're going to see this cache. Boom. There we go. We have this full LinkedIn, all the LinkedIn data, instead of just getting request equals true. We made a call and we had it wait until all that LinkedIn data came back. And so within the same thread where we make the API call, we can have it wait synchronously and then run some business logic on that LinkedIn data. If we wanted to do anything like checking the company size, checking the company industry, or checking and verifying the person's title, we could use it as a tool. Like, again, back to our AI agent example, we could use it as a tool where the agent can make a call to this API start endpoint all the way up here, and it will wait for LinkedIn data to come back so that the agent can ingest all of that LinkedIn data and then add it to its cohesive researching. Lots and lots of ideas that we could do here, but this is basically what we have right now for having our own enrichment API. So you can add this into your inbound workflows or AI agents or anything that you have in mind. So again, let's cover again what it's doing here exactly. Let's go back to the key value store. Again, it's sending in this request ID, and this is what it's using in the background within Replit as the cache key. So while it's waiting that entire time, the value within the cache is none. And then it runs and it runs. As soon as Clay completes its process in the background, it will make its call to Clay/API complete. So back to our API, it's going to make a call to this endpoint, which is only used by our Clay table. And within this endpoint, what's going to happen is right here in this line right here is that it will fill that value with our LinkedIn data. Right now, it's just like an example user in here, but it gets filled. And then back up here in the original thread, because it's using the same DB object and it's storing that request ID, as soon as it detects right in here that that's value is no longer null, it's no longer none, it now has JSON data inside of it, LinkedIn data inside of it. It's going to stop this wait, this little loop, and then it's going to spit out that successful Clay data. So yeah, that's it. This is our API. The last thing that we're going to do is actually deploy this so that we can use this in production, because as soon as we stop, then our API as we have it right now completely dies, because this dev URL, this replit.dev URL only works while we're in here running it. So if we go back over here, we can't use this in production. So I'm going to show you how you can host this. So we're going to go back over to here, or we could just hit this button up here that says deploy, or if you open a new tab and you search for deployments, you'll find it in here, or if you go down to all tools, you'll be able to find deployments. So for me, if I'm ever doing something like setting up an API that I always want listening and waiting for something to complete, I always do a reserved VM. If this is something that you're just testing and you want to just feel the water and you want to pay as you go, then you can use autoscale. So in this case, I use autoscale, but if I was planning on setting this up, and whenever I'm using something like this, whenever I use this exact code for pretty much this is the same exact code for within any of my workflows or production environments, I always use reserved VMs. The only difference is like, think of it like a greenhouse. A greenhouse kind of stays at the same temperature and is always listening. Autoscale is more of like a thermostat where it might fluctuate in energy during the day. You know, if during the night when it gets colder, it's going to work a lot faster. What that means is it scales up to when you get a bunch of traffic and requests, but then it scales down to 0 when you are not getting any requests. Like at 3 a.m., if no one is using your app, then it scales down to 0. You don't pay anything. But that very first user that shows up at 6 a.m., early riser, their requests, their very first request of the day might take a little bit to boot up. So that's a quick overview on the options that you have here for Replit. I'm just going to go ahead and approve the default settings. We can always come back and edit these later. And again, preferably you do not want this to show up. So you don't really want 3 URLs to show up. You don't want to share the two publicly, your networking dev URL or your deployment URL if it's like an internal API that you're using. This is just for APIs because you don't want people calling your Clay enrichment table and then using up your Clay credits. But again, that's what this secret is for. As long as you have this secret, then you should be safe. But just to be extra safe, if it's an API like this where it has delicate resources and credits, try to hide it. So everything looks good here, and I'm going to deploy it as, I'm just going to name it and make it extra a little complex. So this is going to be our new primary domain. I'm going to click deploy, and this might take a minute or two. So I'm going to go ahead and pause, and once it's done deploying, I will come back. So what we're going to do here is actually, so you can see here, 404 not found because we don't have anything here. But if we go to Clay/API start, it's going to say invalid request because it only accepts post requests. Method not allowed. Boom. So we have our hosted URL running and working. So what we have to do is take it and bring it over into 2 places. Number 1, the place where we're calling our API directly. So if you have an inbound workflow, or if you have like a website that you want, you know, as soon as someone submits a form on your website and you want that email sent somewhere, you have to put this URL there if you want to kick off enrichment. But let me show that in a second. But we definitely have to bring this new base URL over to our Clay workflow. So the very last thing that we have to come in here and do is paste that in here, no double backslashes. So that's our first one that works successfully. Save and don't run. And then in here, let's do edit column. I don't want to get that C. Paste, get rid of the extra slash. Come in here, save and don't run. Boom. All right. So now the Clay table will also be able to call our hosted URL no matter what, 24/7. It'll call our hosted URL. So we don't have to be in the REPL running it constantly. It's hosted and running. And we don't even have to click the run button. So going back over here, let's see if even when our REPL is not running, let's make a call directly to it. So I'm going to backfill this. So instead, I'm going to delete this URL that it has in here. There we go. So you can see we're not running our REPL. We're no longer calling our base URL for replit.dev or development environment URL. We're going to call our production one, and it still should work. So what's going to happen is it's going to pause and wait. We're going to go and show our running Clay table, and we're going to get LinkedIn data right back here. Here we go. Let's check our Clay table. We have a running request. Let's go back and see if our API returns LinkedIn data. Let's go ahead and wait in anticipation. And there we go. We now have an API where we can send in emails and get LinkedIn data back. And we now have a method for turning any Clay table into our own API. So if you have like a Clay table, if you're a bigger fan of Clay and like you have some complex tables that start with a webhook, that's the key. Like the only requirement is you have to start with a webhook and you have to end with a webhook. And then you have to use this variation of the code of this replit template. But you're basically able to take any clay table and turn it into an API. So if you have a complex clay table that does stuff like with Clayagent or any other like email or any other enrichment tools, you can use the same method to set it up as an API. If this was helpful at all, or if you have any questions, leave a comment and make sure to like the video if you found this useful.